Next to a belief in God, the belief in a judgment day is likely the most widespread religious concept in the modern world. Most Judgment Day teachings are found in the writings of religious prophets who claim to have received mystical revelations from God concerning the future of the world. This type of prophetic writing is usually called an apocalypse. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek words apo, meaning off, and kalyptine, meaning to cover. An apocalypse is therefore the taking off of a cover, i.e., a revelation. Most apocalypses follow a similar pattern. Mankind will suffer upheaval during a future global cataclysm. The cataclysm will be followed by a day of judgment in which God, or a representative of God, will decide the fate of every person on earth. Only those people who are obedient to the religion preaching the apocalypse will be granted mercy on the day of judgment. Everyone else will be doomed to death or eternal spiritual damnation. The judgment day will be followed by a utopia on earth to be enjoyed only by those who believed and obeyed. End-of-the-world doctrines also make people afraid to explore competing religious systems, such as those offered by religious mavericks. Judgment Day teachings ultimately amount to extortion, obey, or die. So, who originated apocalyptic beliefs on Earth? A supreme being is usually cited. But is a supreme being truly the source? A careful look at history reveals that apocalyptic teachings first arose out of custodial activity and from sources within the corrupted Brotherhood network. The archive recommends viewing our presentation about the Brotherhood of the Snake to gain a full understanding of this ancient network. End-of-the-world doctrines were disseminated by early Brotherhood missionaries and conquerors hand in hand with monotheism. It is therefore not surprising to learn that final battle doctrines have some roots in a famous Brotherhood symbol discovered on ancient Egyptian relics. That symbol was the mythical bird known as the phoenix. Regrettably, the Phoenix legend, like so many other mystical allegories of the Egyptian Brotherhood, distorted important truths. The legend came to convey the false idea that there exists some kind of unalterable law or plan which mandates that spiritual existence must consist of an arduous phoenix-like process of growing, dying by fire, emerging out of the ashes, growing again, dying again, and so on forever. Many end-of-the-world teachings take the philosophy expressed in the Phoenix myth and apply it to the entire human race. When they do so, they often express the notion that human societies must endure continuous ordeals by fire as part of God's great plan. Most apocalypses then veer from standard Phoenix allegory by proclaiming that this process will culminate in a great final battle followed by a utopia. These beliefs encourage people to tolerate and even welcome a world of unremitting physical hardship, conflict, and death. The kind of world that ancient writings say custodians wish their work race to live in. Judgment Day prophecies even spur some people into working to bring about a final battle, because those believers think that it will mean the dawn of a utopia. End-of-the-world teachings were widely disseminated in Persia somewhere between 750 BCE and 550 BCE by a famous Persian prophet named Zoroaster. Zoroaster is cited by historians as one of the earliest prophets to preach the type of monotheism first created by Akhenaten. Zoroaster probably lived closer to 550 BCE than to 750 BCE, although there is a debate on this issue. Traditionally, he has been placed 258 years before Alexander, which some scholars interpret as 258 years before Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire in 330 BCE. An interesting side note, Zoroaster is also known as Zarathustra, a name that provided inspiration for a famous symphonic work composed by Richard Strauss, which became the theme song of the American motion picture 2001, A Space Odyssey. Some Brotherhood branches today state that Zoroaster was an emissary of the ancient Brotherhood. Zoroaster's cosmology was based on the concept of a struggle between good and evil. Zoroaster said that this struggle was to take place over a period of 12,000 years divided into 4 stages. The first stage consisted solely of spiritual existence, during which time a chief god designed the physical universe. During the second stage, the material universe was created, followed by the entrance of the chief god's opponent into the new universe for the purpose of creating problems. The third phase consisted of a battle between the chief god and his rivals over the fate of the many souls who came to occupy the universe. In the fourth and final stage, the chief god was to send in a succession of saviors who would finally defeat the opponent and bring salvation to all spiritual beings in the universe. According to Zoroaster's model, the world is in the fourth stage. Zoroaster appears to have been a sincere and honest reformer. He taught some good lessons about the nature of ethics and its importance to spiritual salvation. He stressed that people have free will. In other matters, however, Zoroaster's religion fell well short of ideal. To understand why, we need only to look at Zoroaster's god. The god of Zoroaster was named Ahura Mazda, which means Lord or Spirit of Knowledge or Wisdom. Zoroaster states that when he was a 30-year-old priest, Ahura Mazda had appeared before him saying that he, Ahura Mazda, was the one true God. Ahura Mazda then proceeded to impart to Zoroaster many of the teachings which constituted Zoroastrianism. When we look to see what sort of creature Ahura Mazda was, we discover good evidence that he was but another custodian pretending to be a god. Ahura Mazda is depicted in some places as a bearded human figure who stands in a stylized circular object. From the circular object protrude 2 stylized wings to indicate that it flies. The round flying object has 2 jutting struts underneath that resemble legs for landing. In other words, Ahura Mazda was a human-like god who flew in a round flying object with landing pads, a custodian. The implication is that Zoroaster's monotheism, with its apocalyptic message, was spread in Persia with custodial assistance, much in the same way that Judaism had been spread under Moses. Apocalyptic doctrines continued to be spread after the death of Zoroaster, especially by Hebrew prophets. The warnings of those Hebrew prophets can be found in the later books of the Old Testament. One of those prophets was Ezekiel, who provided a description of bizarre flying objects. According to Ezekiel's narrative, he was taken aboard a strange craft for the very purpose of being given an apocalyptic message to spread, indicating once again that custodians were the ultimate creators of Judgment Day teachings. As year 1 CE approached, the Hebrew religion had become well settled in the Middle East. It was, however, undergoing many changes, some of which were caused by the extension of the Roman Empire into Palestine. The Romans, who had themselves been driven to conquest by strange mystical religions with definite brotherhood undertones, often made life difficult for the Jews. In this milieu, a number of Jewish sects arose which were often at odds with one another, except in regard to one matter. The Romans were not welcome in Palestine. Some Hebrew sects proclaimed the coming of a Messiah from God, a Messiah who would prevail in the eternal struggle of good against evil and bring freedom to the oppressed Jews. This idea became quite popular among the Hebrews of Palestine, even though its strong political slant made it dangerous. Old Testament messianic prophecies began as early as 750 BCE with the prophet Isaiah. Jewish apocalypses appeared sporadically after that, yet often enough to keep fear of a world cataclysm alive. Examples include Prophet Joel circa 400 BCE and Daniel circa 165 BCE. Ironically, the prophecies were quite dire and expressed tremendous hostility against the Jewish people themselves, even though the Hebrews were meant to ultimately benefit from the prophecies. Old Testament prophets described the people of Israel as wicked and sinful. They quoted Jehovah threatening all manner of calamities against the people of Israel and against the oppressors of Israel. No one was to be spared. To give the flavor of these predictions, here is a quote from the last book in the Old Testament, written shortly before 445 BCE. For look, the day comes that all will burn like an oven, and all the proud and all those who act wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that comes shall burn them up, said the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. But to you who fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and you shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall. And you will tread down the wicked, for they shall be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day that I shall do this, said the Lord of hosts. Remember the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded to him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Observe, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, so that I do not come and destroy the earth with a curse. Malachi 4, 1-6. The preceding passage preaches the coming of a special messenger from God named Elijah, who was the Hebrews' competition against Maitreya of the Buddhist religion. The Buddhist, perhaps sensing the one-upmanship or falling prey to corrupted brotherhood influences, reshaped the Maitreya legend to resemble monotheistic apocalypses. This created the illusion that the Hebrews and the Buddhists were waiting for the same person when in fact they were not. Brotherhood monotheists were, and still are, waiting for a messenger from God coupled with a day of judgment. The Buddhists were simply awaiting a friend who was smart and caring enough to finish Buddha's work without the necessity of the entire world ending. Modern Hebrews are still waiting for Elijah to appear, while Christians believe that Elijah was John the Baptist, the man who baptized Jesus Christ. Old Testament prophets expressed another important idea. Jehovah would continue to manipulate people into war. For I, God, will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations. Zechariah 14, 1-2. This is a startling quote, because it states God's intention to bring many nations into conflict by first supporting one side and then backing the other. Such actions are textbook Machiavellian. God's intention to make brother fight brother was expressed in the same year by another prophet. And I will overthrow the throne of the kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the heathen, and I will overthrow the chariots, and those that ride in them, and the horses and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. Bible believers still think that a supreme being is behind the vicious Machiavellian intentions described in the Bible. The ancient astronauts hypothesis seems to provide a true breakthrough by pointing to a brutal technological society, not a supreme being, as the more likely source of such machinations. When people adhere to apocalyptic prophecies, they usually do so because they believe in predestiny. Predestiny is the idea that the future is already created and unalterable, and that some people have a special ability to see that future. Does predestiny really exist? For the sake of discussion, let us assume that it does. At any given moment in the present, there is a future already created that is as solid and as real as any moment in the past or present. perhaps time is not as linear as we have believed. If such a future already exists, does that mean that it is inevitable and must occur? The simple answer is no. The future is shaped largely by intention backed by action. The stronger the intention and the better it's backed up by action, the more solid the future will tend to be. The future is therefore malleable. A future reality, no matter how solid it is or how many prophets have agreed to its existence, can be changed. It will be irreversible only if people continue to perform or fail to perform those actions which cause that future to come about, and no one does anything effective enough to counter those actions or inactions. Prophecy has really only one value, as a tool to either change or ensure the future. The problem with a seer who foresees a tragic event which later comes true is that he or she divined insufficient information to do anything about it. For example, the famous American prophet Edgar Cayce predicted a worldwide Holocaust in the 1990s. Because of Mr. Cayce's reputed ability to perceive such things, many people were convinced that such an event would occur. Unfortunately, Mr. Cayce was not able to expand enough on his prediction to offer the detailed information which might be used to alter the events he predicted. His prophecy is therefore woefully incomplete. There have been many end-of-the-world episodes in world history. They have all fulfilled the religious prophecies except on one very crucial point. Not one of them brought about a new era of peace and salvation as promised. Despite that dismal record, many people today are preaching that yet one more end of the world or final battle is about to make life better. The end of the world is something that has always been fascinating to societies throughout history. Christianity takes the subject head-on in the final book of the New Testament. The book of Revelation takes place after the epistles of St. John and the Gospels. As the final book in the Bible, it fittingly tells the story of the final prophecy of man's time on earth. The book of Revelation's writer and time of writing, like much of the Bible, is up for debate. It is believed that the book was written in 96 CE. The year 96 CE would mean that Domitian was the emperor of Rome during the time of its release. Domitian was not a Christian himself and is said to have persecuted Christians and Jewish people during his reign. This, too, is heavily debated. The book of Revelation was officially added to the Bible in the 4th century CE. The traditional view is that the John who wrote the book of John and the John who wrote Revelation are the same guy. This obviously lent a lot of weight to the final book of the Bible if someone as important as one of the original 12 disciples wrote it. Apostle John was supposedly exiled to the Greek island of Patmos after being boiled in oil, but coming out perfectly fine. Evidence for the same author include a few instances of similar word usage in both books, and that was enough to convince many early church fathers. But modern biblical scholars don't agree. They think these guys were two very different Johns. First, the one that wrote Revelation can't drop his own name in the text enough, while the author of the book of John never mentions his. While they do both call Jesus a lamb, they use different Greek words for that animal. And when it comes to the Greek language, Apostle John writes it flawlessly, while Revelation John has a lot of mistakes and doesn't seem to be a native speaker. These, plus some major differences in theology, have modern scholars pretty sure they were different people. The book of Revelation can be broken down into 7 parts. In fact, a lot of things in the book arrive in sevens, since it's a holy number. The first part of Revelation is considered a bit of a prologue in which John receives his first vision from Jesus about the end of the world. John is told to write the visions down as they come to him. Part 2 is a clear message to the 7 churches that were deemed troublesome at the time. This section is why people think that the book of Revelation is a direct address rather than a prediction of humankind's ultimate, literal destiny. The third section is the start of the tribulation. 7 years of hardships like war, disease, and famine will affect the earth to test people's faith in God. This is where things start to turn into an action movie. Known as the 7 scenes in heaven, this part introduces the 4 living creatures, a lion, a calf, a man, and an eagle, to the vision. The creatures are seen with multiple wings and eyes. The 4 living creatures are attendants to God, and each one has a different horseman that they call forth. In Part 4, after the 7 scenes, we are introduced to the 7 seals. As the seals are opened, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse make their grand entrances. War, famine, disease, and death fall upon humankind until the 7th seal is broken. When the 7th seal is broken, the 7 trumpets of God are sounded, and God's wrath is felt across the planet through natural disasters. This is also where the Antichrist, also known as the Beast, is introduced. In Part 5, war breaks out in heaven. Michael, the archangel, fights a dragon. That dragon gives the Beast, who emerges from the sea and happens to have 10 horns, permission to rule the world. Soon after, people are forced to bear the mark of the Beast. In Part 6, before the temple of God can be opened to those who survived the apocalypse and accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior, there are 7 plagues that need to occur, but no one knows when they will start or end. This means bodies of water will turn to blood, people will break out in sores, and a heat wave will burn people's bodies, in addition to other horrible things. And finally, in Part 7, after more suffering, Jesus eventually gets married, casts the beast into the lake of fire, and the remaining souls are judged in the final 7 visions to John. The book of Revelation is basically a fever dream of epic proportions. It shows a vision of the world being destroyed in ways most modern horror writers would be hard-pressed to top. The Bible isn't the first book you might turn to for gratuitous violence, but it's definitely in there. Everyone has heard of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, but less well known are the horses of Revelation chapter 9, 17 through 19, which have the heads of lions and tails made of snakes. Those horses breathe fire, smoke, and sulfur, and kill 1/3 of all humans. There are your standard horrible plague symptoms as well. We have non-believers getting painful sores all over their bodies, being boiled alive by the sun, or being pelted to death by giant hailstones falling to the earth. If that's not enough for you, there's also the sun turning black, the moon turning to blood, and a dragon that almost eats an infant. Perhaps 2 of the most bizarre events must be the locusts and the winepress. The locusts descend on Earth but are given scorpion stings, which they use not to kill humans, but only to torture them for 5 months. The winepress is used to smush people to a pulp until their blood is flowing 5 feet deep through the streets. Considering all that crazy is going on, no wonder Revelation says mankind will long to die. But since they can't catch a break, they have no such luck. Revelation is probably the most difficult book in the Bible to interpret accurately. It's lousy with symbolism and numerology and all these coded messages that your average reader no longer understands, and therefore often takes to mean something completely different. Many people interpret Revelation as a sign of what is going to happen in the future. But for its author, it wasn't a mystical prophecy of something that was going to occur thousands of years later. It was both a rousing propaganda message and revenge fantasy all in one. The author of Revelation had just lived through an unimaginable catastrophe. In 70 CE, an armed Jewish revolt in Jerusalem was put down by 60,000 Roman soldiers who also burned down the temple and destroyed the city. This was not how things were supposed to go. Early followers of Jesus didn't think his return was something far off, but very soon, even in their lifetimes, he was supposed to come back and destroy Rome, the empire that killed him. Instead, Rome was the one winning, and Jesus was nowhere to be found. What happened to the plan? So, the author of Revelation, known as John, wrote a book about how Jesus was totally going to return and annihilate those Romans. He was writing an anti-Roman propaganda piece that also served as a motivational tract. John was like a coach at halftime if that coach was talking about forcing the opposing team to drink from a river of blood. The aim was to make sure the followers of Jesus didn't give up or despair. He was definitely going to come back and kick some butt very soon. Of course, others believe that the stories in Revelation are prophecies meant to foretell salvation and the fate of humankind. There are dragons, beasts, pit locusts, and other monstrous creatures in Revelation. Because of how fantastical the book is, many see the creatures as allegories for modern-day people. For example, people thought Ronald Reagan was the beast because his first, middle, and last names each contained 6 letters, making 666, or the number of the beast. Some people may have gotten their ideas about the Antichrist and the sign of the beast 666, not from actually reading Revelation, but from watching a movie titled The Omen, which was released in 1976. 666 and the beast were never supposed to represent a future evil Antichrist who Jesus would return and defeat. Revelation is just lousy with numerology, and 666 is very much a part of that. The verse in question says, "Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. The number was never meant to be random. It stood for a very specific name, that of Emperor Nero. Christians had good reason to absolutely hate Nero, since he had cracked down on their religion violently, including a rumor that he had used Christians as torches in his garden by burning them alive. He was the ultimate bad guy, so he got specially singled out as an evil beast. John couldn't get away with openly writing bad stuff about Nero, so he used the Jewish numerology system, which the right readers would have easily been able to crack. Nor is the mark of the beast actually on the beast. It's on everyone else. Revelation chapter 13, 16 through 17 says, "The beast made everyone on earth get this mark, or they couldn't buy and sell anything." In reality, this mark may have simply been Roman imperial stamps, coins, or even official tattoos. Considering how much Revelation has shaped the world, it's extremely concerning that it probably shouldn't have been included in the Bible at all. Christianity existed for hundreds of years without an official Bible. There were plenty of books being passed around, but no one had decided what was considered legit. Around 360 years after Jesus died, the process of putting together Christianity's holy book began, and perhaps no one had more say over what made it into the New Testament than Bishop Athanasius. Described as pugnacious and fiery, this controversial character managed to get deposed and exiled a whopping 5 times in his 46 years as a bishop. He also absolutely loved Revelation. He didn't love it because it spoke to him on a deep spiritual level, but because he saw its potential as a way to attack any Christian who questioned his authority. Instead of non-believers and Romans being the enemy described in Revelation, he saw the bad guys as the people of his own religion who didn't do and say exactly what he thought they should. Including Revelation in the Bible meant he could threaten perceived heretics with that wine press stuff. But many church leaders wanted to see Revelation end up in the scrap heap instead of closing out the Bible. Athanasius' predecessor called it unintelligible, irrational, and false. Not a rousing endorsement of what some people now see as God's actual words, since in the end, obviously, Athanasius got his way. It is interesting to note that the book of Revelation is rejected by several sects of Christianity, including the Church of the East and Eastern Orthodox Christians. Even Martin Luther and John Calvin both rejected it or refused to acknowledge it. Since Revelation is often interpreted as a story of a future apocalypse, it gets cited as proof of an upcoming apocalypse by a lot of end-time prognosticators. In the old days, it wasn't people you'd consider crazies either. Scotsman John Napier, born in 1550, is celebrated for his contributions to math and science, but less so for his writing on Revelation that predicted the world would end in 1688 or 1700. Conveniently for Napier, he would be 6 feet under by that point, so he'd never find out if he was wrong. Same with the German pastor Johann Bengel, who calculated the 1,000-year reign of Christ prophesied in Revelation would begin in 1836. Bengel would have had to live to 149 to find out if he was correct. David Koresh of the Branch Davidian cult saw himself as the Lamb mentioned in Revelation and was preparing to open the 7 seals to bring on the end times, which he took to mean he should publish a book, when he and many of his cult members died in Waco, Texas in 1993. These days, David Meade interprets a description of a woman in Revelation to mean a complicated astronomical combination of the constellation Virgo, the planet Jupiter, the moon, the sun, and various other stars and planets will bring on the beginning of the end. He first announced this would happen September 23, 2017. Being wrong did not dissuade Meade, and he set the for real date as April 23, 2018. Some of our regular viewers will remember Meade from a presentation we released about that 2018 date because he included planet Nibiru in his failed prognostication. Of course, a vast number of today's Christian evangelists, preachers, and faith-based media producers serve as the modern version of the original doomsayers. Can anyone say left behind? And the book of Revelation is the most potent clickbait in their arsenal. The book of Revelation means different things to different people. The modern consensus is that there are 4 primary ways to interpret it. This approach sometimes is called preterist, meaning that the events described in Revelation all took place in the past and the work must be read in that ancient historical context. It is almost universally followed in both New Testament scholarship and by scholars of Christian history. It is also the view taken within many Christian denominations, although it is often amended to suggest that all the historical events are past and that Revelation was describing a situation in the Roman Empire, but that the final judgment in some literal sense is still to come as a future event. However, religious interpretations of Revelation throughout Christian history have not always followed this approach. This view holds that while the precise historical circumstances of Revelation pertain to the Roman world at the end of the 1st century CE, that it nonetheless has a kind of universal and timeless message for God's dealing with humanity in all generations. Thus, it looks for symbolic elements that may apply across the ages. This symbolic or allegorical view is what lay behind St. Augustine's reading of Revelation, in which he argued that the 1,000-year reign was not a literal number at all, but a figurative way of describing the age of the church on earth. This view has been the dominant one in most mainstream Christian interpretation, especially in Catholic tradition. It has also been influential in some philosophical appropriations of Revelation in Western thinking. While the symbolic history view was more or less the official view of Revelation adopted by the medieval church, there continued to be literalist readings throughout the Middle Ages. In general, these views took a literal view of the 1,000 years as being the current age of the church. As a result, this way of looking at Revelation led some to look to it for ongoing events in the history of Christianity. A new mode of interpreting Revelation beginning in the early 19th century was known as the future history view. It grew mostly out of Protestant theology with a strong reforming element both in Britain and America. It also drew on the strong tradition of literalist interpretation of Revelation as predicting contemporary events that have become popular in these areas through the continuous history view. But this new mode began to look at the past history of Christianity from the New Testament through the Middle Ages and down to its own time in a different light. From this perspective, it was hard to compute how the 1,000 years, if taken literally, could refer to the past history of the church, since that would place the inauguration of the millennium within the time frame of the medieval Catholic Church. The new view, therefore, began to argue that none of the events described in the book of Revelation after chapters 1 through 3, for example, John's vision and the letters to the 7 churches of Asia, had yet come to pass. All the images of Revelation 4 through 22 were instead considered to be predictions of future events that would come to pass in literal terms as the return of Christ and the end approached. Thus, the view looks at Revelation as a prediction of future history. How a person deals with the book of Revelation can often depend on his or her predisposition to fear-mongering. According to evolutionary psychology, humans have a strong impulse to pay attention to danger because awareness of dangers has been important for survival throughout our evolutionary history. The effect is amplified by cultural evolution when the news media cater to people's appetite for news about dangers. The attention of citizens is an extremely contested resource by news media, political campaigners, social reformers, advertisers, governments, and certainly the church. And as we mentioned before, the vast number of today's Christian evangelists, preachers, and faith-based media producers serve as the modern version of the original doomsayers. And the book of Revelation is the most potent clickbait in their fear-mongering arsenal. Of course, the inherent danger is that collective fear is likely to produce an authoritarian mentality, desire for a strong leader, strict discipline, punitiveness, intolerance, xenophobia, and less democracy. Historically, the effect has been exploited by political entrepreneurs in many countries for purposes such as increasing support for an authoritarian government, avoiding democratization, or preparing the population for war. Ironically, the book of Revelation may be one of the most authentic books in the New Testament, looking through a preterist point of view. It was simply a product of its time, a contemporaneous history written in code and allegory that allowed early Christian society to persevere the tribulations of their own times. To put it in terms that today's generation can possibly relate, the book of Revelation is kind of like the modern Superman comic. It literally describes how an otherworldly superhero overcomes the evil that existed on the earth at the time of its writing. In fact, the parallels are quite intriguing. From the heavens above, Father Jor-el sends his son Kal-el as a baby to earth, just like God the Father sent his son Jesus to earth. It is worth noting that El is the Hebrew word for God. Kal-el was sent to earth in a star-like spaceship, which is similar to Christ's first coming that was heralded by a star. Upon his arrival, Kal-el was raised by two earthly parents, the same as Jesus. When Kal-el comes of age, he visits the Arctic wilderness to speak with his father's spirit, just like Jesus' visit to the wilderness. Thereafter, Kal-el embraces his mission as Superman to fight for truth and justice, which is similar to Jesus' mission. Superman's mortal enemy is Lex Luthor, who envies his power, just like Satan, who wanted to be like God. Superman came back to life after being put to death, just like Jesus rose from the dead. So what do these parallels have to do with the book of Revelation? Well, the narrative is essentially one of a supernatural being who comes to earth to counter the forces of evil and deliver his people to salvation. In much the same way, the author of Revelation created a work of fiction that allowed the protagonist to be victorious against the existing power structure, which was the Roman Empire. And it seems the oppressed and subjugated early Christian society was willing and ready to accept their hero wrapped in a new allegorical prophecy that ultimately worked out in their favor.